Now we're actually going to start building our motion graphics template, and it all starts with the Sourcerectattime expression. This expression is a little bit confusing, even if you've used expressions before, because it can give us lots of different values, but those values are very important for what we're going to use it for, which is sizing a rectangle to a text layer, no matter what's typed into it. So this is what allows us to give the user of our template the ability to edit a text field and have the design update the way that we want it to look. No matter what's typed in there, the box is always going to size to that text. So don't worry if you're a little bit overwhelmed already with expressions. I'm gonna walk you through this very slowly and we're gonna reuse it a lot. So let's take a look. Now, before we even dive into that, I just want to point out something about JavaScript and expressions. This, starting with a lowercase letter and then every word after that being capitalized, is called camel case, because it's kind of like camel humps, right? Coming up and down. That's a very common way to write your expressions, but it's also the way that most methods in JavaScript are written, starting with a lowercase and every word after that being capitalized. Okay, so that's the technical syntax of how this expression is written. But what exactly does it mean? Well, Sourcerectattime is just the name of the method, and it means it's giving us the source rectangle at a given time. And the source rectangle is the bounding box of any layer. So these transform controls, if you connected all of these dots, it would make a rectangle, and the Sourcerectattime expression is going to give us the dimensions or the size of that rectangle. But that's just the first half. There's also the @time half, which means if the size of this layer changes for any reason, the contents change, or say you animated this text, that source rectangle is going to update at the current time in your timeline. So whatever size it is at any given point, this will give us the value of that rectangle size. And we have these parentheses here, which allow us to add in some arguments, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But this on its own actually isn't going to give us what we need, because there are 4 different properties that we can pull out of Sourcerectattime, and we need all 4 of them for this to work. Those values are the width of the rectangle, the height of the rectangle, the left value, and the top value. So width and height make sense, right? It's the width of the box and the height of the box. But what are the left and top values, and why are they important? Well, if I zoom in here nice and close on this text layer, you'll notice that the anchor point for this text layer is in the bottom left corner. For any other layer, it's usually right in the center of the layer. But the reason why this is in the bottom left is because this text layer is different than a solid layer or a shape layer. You can type in it, and as you type, it goes from left to right because my paragraph is set to left justify. I can align this to the center, and then the anchor point is aligned to the center horizontally, but vertically it's still down in the lower part of the text layer. If I right justify it, then it's on the right side, but still offset down vertically. I'm going to switch this back to left justified, and let's talk about why this is. Well, text and typography in general has what's called a baseline. And the baseline is basically where your text is sitting. Now this is kind of a stylized font, so it's not very symmetrical. This leg on the A is lower than this leg. But if I zoom in really close, you can see that that anchor point is pretty darn close to where this first leg of the A is resting. If I bring up my rulers by pressing Control or Command R and then click and drag to make a guide, I'll align it with the anchor point for this layer, right there in the center of that anchor point. And I want to be super precise to illustrate this. All right, so there my anchor point is now centered up, aligned perfectly with those guides. And you'll notice that a lot of these letters are resting right there on that guide. This is the baseline for the text. Characters for fonts are designed on top of this baseline for alignment. So that's where After Effects puts the anchor point for a text layer vertically. And while it does look like the anchor point is aligned horizontally with the left edge of this text layer, it actually can be slightly off, and it's not very visible with this particular character. But if I try a different character like a Y, and then I pan up a little bit, you can see that the tip of this Y on this arm right here is going beyond that anchor point. So I like to call this horizontal point the origin of the text layer. This is another guide that the type designer designs their type off of. Some characters will overlap it, others will align to it, but After Effects is placing this anchor point at this position because that's how the type was designed, with that point in mind as the origin of the text layer. Understanding that is going to be very important in just a little bit. But now that we understand that, let's just get back to our text layer, and I'm going to get rid of my guides, hide my rulers, and let's center this up again. So I'll just get that right in the middle, and let's make a rectangle. So I'm going to go to my rectangle tool and double click on it. I'll drag it below all this text, and right there is good. And I need to get to the size of this rectangle. So I'll go into the rectangle group, into the rectangle path, and here I have my size and position. These are the two properties that we need to add expressions to in order to get this text box to size to this text and stick with it no matter what. So first, let's just work on the Sourcerectattime width and height and plug that directly into the size of this rectangle. So to add an expression, remember you hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and click on that stopwatch, and then we can start writing the expression. So let's say Sourcerect, and After Effects auto-completes the rest of it for me. I'll double click on it. So we have Sourcerectattime, open and close parentheses. I don't need to put anything inside this just yet, but I'll go after that closing parentheses and add a period, which remember is kind of like a separator in the hierarchy. So After Effects is seeing, okay, you want me to use Sourcerectattime, and then what? Well, I want you to find the width. And that's it. I just want the width property, and then I'll close this off with a semicolon and apply the expression. And nothing happens. I actually am getting an error. And this is actually for a couple different reasons. For one, Sourcerectattime.width on its own isn't giving After Effects enough information. It needs to know what source rectangle we want it to pull from. In this case, we want it to be from this text layer, and I didn't specify that. So let me give myself a little bit more room to view this. And I want to define a variable for that text layer. So let's do that. I'm going to go into this expression, and then just before the Sourcerectattime expression that we wrote, I'm going to drop down a line. And at the top, type in var for variable, space, and then I'll call this txt for text. Remember, you can name that however you want. I'm just going to make it easily identifiable as txt for text, and then space equals space. And I'll use the expression pick whip to click and drag to the text layer. I don't need to go into any of the properties. I'm just telling After Effects this is the layer I want to be referenced. So I'll let go of that, it fills it in, and I just want to make sure that I finish off that line with a semicolon. So now I have a variable for that text layer. Next, I need to go at the start of this line of code and type in txt dot to start off that path for After Effects, telling it, look at that text layer's Sourcerectattime width property. Now I'll apply that, and I still have an error. So we solved one problem, but we still have another one. So let's find out what that error is. If I click on this warning sign, it's letting me know the expression is disabled. Down at the bottom, it's saying that the expression result must be of dimension 2, not 1. So what this is saying is I'm only giving it a one-dimensional value, but I need it to have 2 dimensions. And that's because my size value is actually 2 different values, a width and a height. So if I'm calculating a single value, it breaks because After Effects is expecting 2 values. This is called an array, any property that uses more than one value. So let me show you how you write an array in an expression really quickly. I'm just going to select this entire line by triple clicking on it and then cutting it. So Control X or Command X on a Mac. And instead of an expression, I'm just going to write a hard-coded value in an array. To do that, I'm going to press the left square bracket. After Effects will automatically put a closing square bracket for me just so I don't forget. That is something that you have to do. But now I can write 2 values within these brackets. So let's say I want the width to be 400. I'll type that out, and then I press comma to separate the 2 values in the array. And for the height, let's say I want that to be 150. I'll move over and end that with a semicolon and apply this. And now my rectangle size is 400 by 150, exactly what I typed in here. It's not using this variable, and the expression that I cut isn't being evaluated, obviously, but this is how we write an array. Square brackets and 2 values separated by a comma. If it was a 3-dimensional property, if it was a 3D layer, then you would need to do 3 numbers, each separated by that comma. Now that we know how to write this array, I want to swap out this first number, the width of this size property, with that expression that I had cut. So let me paste that back in now, Control V or Command V on a Mac. And now we have that variable for this layer, Sourcerectattime width, within this first value. I just need to make sure that I take off that semicolon, because that only goes at the very end of your line of code. So in the width, we should be getting the width of the text layer that we're referencing. And the height is still set to 150. So I'm just gonna do some housekeeping really quick before I apply this and drop it down one more line. That's just how I like to write my expressions, variables separated by one line from the actual expression. But now I can click off, that is applied, and look at that. The text box is the exact same width as the text layer. Now it's not aligned perfectly, but if I just move it around and hold down Control or Command on a Mac, I can snap it to the very center of that text layer and it's aligned now. If I click off of it, you can see that is perfectly aligned to the size of the text. But what about the height? Well, let's go back into our expression and just copy what we have here and paste it in place of this hard-coded 150 value. So I'll paste it there, and all I need to do is change width to height. And that will pull the height value out of the source rectangle for that layer. I apply it, and there we go. Our box is perfectly sized to that text. But if we take a look at this expression one more time, this isn't all that easy to look at and identify, right? It's a long line of code with a bunch of repeated text. We can actually clean this up quite a bit if we use some more variables. So one great thing about variables is as soon as you've defined it, you can start using it on the very next line. So I'm going to add another variable, drop down, say var space, and then I'll name this W for width, space equals space. And what I want here is what I have down here in my array for the width. So I'm just going to cut that and paste it up here. Finish that line with a semicolon. And then I'm going to drop down again, var h for height, space equals space, and then select this text, cut, and paste it up here, finish it off with a semicolon. By the way, all these spaces is purely for visual organization. JavaScript does not pay attention to spaces or line breaks. You could have all of your text on one line with no spaces and it would be able to read it just fine. But as a human, it's much easier to identify and visually organize your code if you space stuff out and break it up by lines. Okay, but back to our expression, we have all three of our variables for the text layer, the Sourcerectattime width, and Sourcerectattime height. Now we have an empty array, but I can just plug in W for width and H for height, apply it, nothing changes. It gives us the exact same result, but it's much easier to read our actual expression now. All the complicated stuff is up here in our variables, and it's all organized by line, so it's easy to pick out and modify if we need to. I could actually clean this up even more. If I take the Sourcerectattime part of the expression in each one of these variables and cut that and include it in the source text variable, I'll just paste it right after text. Now I can get rid of that Sourcerectattime on both the width and height variable, and it's much easier to read now. Now I'm just looking at the text layer's width and the text layer's height. And that might seem a little bit pointless, but it allows me to then modify what's between these parentheses on the Sourcerectattime method for both of the following variables, which we are going to need to do in a little bit to get our box to work properly. So you can think of these variables as kind of like pre-comps. It's a way to store information that you're going to reuse over and over again. Just like animating with pre-comps makes animation faster and more efficient, variables can make expressions much more efficient. If I click off of this to apply it, you'll see that we get the exact same result, but it's just a much cleaner block of code to look at. The variables are very easy to identify, and our array is extremely simple. So we've got the text box sized to the text layer now, so we should be able to type something else in here, right? Well, let me just edit this text layer and say something else, and well, that's not exactly working, is it? First of all, if I move my text layer around, the box is not moving with it, and you saw that this box was expanding, but it's not the same. And that's because text layers, or at least this one, is left justified. It's expanding from the left to the right, and that left point is never moving. But we're just adding an expression to the size property of this rectangle path. And if I disable that expression really quickly, by clicking on this little blue equal sign, that enables or disables the expression, and just adjust the size width, you can see that rectangles size from the center of the layer, not the left edge. So that actually makes sense. This expression is doing what it's supposed to be doing right now, which is size the box to the size of the layer. It has nothing to do with the position of the box. So we only have part of the problem solved. Let's re-enable that expression, and I'll type this back out to just saying text, so it's a little bit smaller. And let's take a look at the next issue, which is getting the box to follow the text layer. Well, this is really easy. I just need to first align it, and I'll hold down Control to snap it to the center of the layer again, so it's perfectly aligned with that text. And then I'm just going to parent this layer to the text layer. So now, wherever the text goes, the box goes with it. And let me just rename this text box just for organization. And I'll show you the next issue. If I go to the character panel and do something like maybe switch it to all caps, see that text box shifted over to the left. And if I change the size of the text, it's scaling from the center of the layer again, but the text layer is scaling from its anchor point. Again, this is exactly what should be happening. The only property that we've added an expression to is the size. So how can we get the positioning working? Well, let me undo, getting back to where we have this nicely aligned text. And I'm going to collapse up the size property just so we have more room. Just below the size is the position property. This is what we need to be able to shift the box around left and right and up and down. And because this layer is sizing from that anchor point, remember that origin for the text layer aligned to the baseline and the left edge, that origin of the text, this is where the Sourcerectattime left and top values are going to come into play. The left value is the distance between the left edge of the text layer and the origin of that text layer. And the top value is the distance between the top of the layer and the baseline. If we know those two values, then we can change the anchor point for this text box, specifically the rectangle path, to be not in the center of the layer, but aligned to the origin of that text layer. And I'll show you how we do that right now. So let's go into the position and add an expression. Now, we actually can reuse a lot of the expression that we already wrote on the size. So let me just go back into that, and I'll just copy all of it. So copy, and then go back into my position expression and paste. Now, this is not going to give us what we want. This is taking size values and plugging it into the position, not what we want. So let's go back into that expression and start modifying some things. First of all, this first variable can stay exactly the same. We want to reference the text layer's Sourcerectattime, but for the width and height, we need to modify this a little bit. And to explain this a little bit more easier, I'm going to just make a new rectangle, and I'm going to size it to 100 by 200. All right, and we're going to move this up here so we can just focus on it for a second. So let's go into that rectangle, position and size. These are the two values we need to worry about. As I move the position around, you see that the anchor point stays in the center. So what do I need to do to get this to be in the top left corner? Well, if we take a look at these two values between the size and the position and how they're related, it looks like half of the size will be the position that we need to get that to be aligned, which makes sense. Half of the width and half of the height from the center of the rectangle will get us to the top left corner. So another way that I could have done this is just said, make the position half of the size. So in an expression, I could just use the property pickwhip to select the size. And if we open this up and take a look, you'll notice it's not giving me any errors, even though we just have one line of code. This is an array, so you'd think we need two numbers, right? Well, if you add an expression to an array and you reference another property that is also an array with the same number of values, then we don't have to write it in an array. It's automatically going to pull the first value into the first value and the second value into the second value. But you can see the anchor point is up here. My rectangle moved down and to the right. It's because it's just pulling the exact same numbers. I want half of that. So at the end of this line of code, I'm just going to say divided by 2 and then apply it. And there we go. Now that top left corner of the rectangle is aligned to the anchor point of the layer. So if I size this now, it's going to scale from that top left corner. All right, so that was the illustration. Now let's actually implement it into our text box. So right now it's scaling from the center, but we want it to scale from the top left corner. So let's just go back into our expression and add divided by 2 to the end of the width and the height values for this Sourcerectattime. That's all I need to change. If I click off, the rectangle is now aligned its top left corner to the anchor point for the layer. Now it's not aligned to the text anymore, so I do need to click and drag again, hold down Control, and snap it to the center, but now there we go, top left corner, it's aligned. But we're not done. That's just the starting point. We don't want it to scale from the top left corner. We want it to scale from where the anchor point is on the text layer. Well, remember, the .height part of Sourcerectattime gives us the difference between the height of the layer and that baseline. And right now, our text box is aligned to the top left edges of this text layer. So it's already at the starting point where we measure the distance from on the Sourcerectattime.left and the Sourcerectattime.top. So let's factor those things in to our expression. I'm going to drop down another line and add a variable that is L for left, space equals space, txt dot left, semicolon. And remember, that's this entire line of code, and then we're just adding the dot left. And then I'll drop down another line, var t for top, space equals space, txt dot top, semicolon. Now I have those two variables and I can factor them into my array. So we want to take where that anchor point is right now and add to it the left value that this variable right here is going to give us. So I'm going to say width plus L for left and height plus T for top. If I did everything right, I'm going to apply this and it should work. Now the text box did move up, but if we click on it and take a look, the anchor point is in the bottom left corner now. And that is what we want. If I zoom in real nice and close, you can see it's not perfectly aligned to the bottom left corner of the box, but neither is the anchor point for this text layer. So this looks like it's working. Let's shift this down one more time. I'll grab it, click and drag on that anchor point and hold Control or Command, snap it to the text layer's anchor point. And now let's try typing something else. So something else. Look at that. The text box is perfectly aligned to that text layer. If I make it all caps, if I change its size, if I change its justification, it's always going to stick to that text because we're basing the position off of the baseline and origin of that layer. So between sizing the box correctly and positioning it correctly, this text box is always going to go exactly where it needs to. But you might be thinking that doesn't look all that great. I don't necessarily want it to be exactly sized to that text layer. And you're right. This is just the base foundation. Think of it like building a house. It's the foundation layer that we can then build on top of. So to make this text box a little bit bigger, since this is a shape layer, all I need to do is go into the contents and add a offset paths. And now I have this very easy to control slider, basically, to increase or decrease the margin for my text. And again, this will change based on whatever you put into this text. It will dynamically update to always fit to it. And because it's a rectangle, I could even go into it and say round it off if I want it to be more like a pill shape. It's as easy as that. But this is the real foundation of how we're going to build dynamic templates that respond to whatever's typed into them. All right, I know that was a whole lot of information thrown at you. Hopefully you were able to absorb it and it makes sense. I think at this point, if you're up to it, you should start getting in After Effects and trying to recreate what I showed you how to make. Watch through it with me. You can slow down the playback speed or just be pausing it, but you should actually try and code this for yourself so you can see what kind of things might trip you up and how you can get it all working together to actually make a box that sizes to the text. Now, you might be thinking this isn't what I want my template to look like, but the reality is With a text layer, and especially with the lower third, you're almost always going to have a rectangle behind that text layer. Or maybe you want to add 2 lines. Well, we're going to get into that in the next lesson. So don't get too hung up on the actual look of your template at this point. Just know that this is really fundamental for making a motion graphics template that is dynamic enough to give to somebody so that you know it's always going to look the way that you want it to. But go ahead and jump in there, start writing your own expressions, and get to the point where you can have a rectangle sizing to that text layer no matter what you do to that text layer. Good luck.